A Chinese slave was sold to a mountain man as punishment by her master, but he had shocking plans. That's what folks whispered in the town of Bitter Creek. They said she was thrown away like trash and handed to a man feared more than wolves. But what happened next didn't fit no tale they'd heard before. He didn't hurt her. He didn't chain her. He gave her wood for the fire and silence for her wounds. And in that silence, something changed. Why would a man like him show kindness? And why did the cruel master return with blood on his mind? When the past comes knocking and the valley turns cold, one question remains. Who was saved that day? And who was judged too soon? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how these stories connect us across mountains, prairies, and time itself. If you still believe in decency, redemption, and the strength of quiet hearts, then you're part of this story too. Let me know which state you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so we can keep bringing you tales that matter. A Chinese slave was sold to a mountain man as punishment by her master, but he had shocking plans. That's what folks whispered in the town of Bitter Creek. They said she was thrown away like trash and handed to a man feared more than wolves. But what happened next didn't fit no tale they'd heard before. He didn't hurt her. He didn't chain her. He gave her wood for the fire and silence for her wounds. And in that silence, something changed. Why would a man like him show kindness? And why did the cruel master return with blood on his mind? When the past comes knocking and the valley turns cold, one question remains. Who was saved that day, and who was judged too soon? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how these stories connect us across mountains, prairies, and time itself. If you still believe in decency, redemption, and the strength of quiet hearts, then you're part of this story too. Let me know which state you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so we can keep bringing you tales that matter. They called her Mei Lin, though few in Bitter Creek bothered to learn her name. To most, she was just that Chinese girl, bought cheap to wash clothes for the railroad crews and serve tea that no man drank politely. The town didn't look her in the eyes, but they sure talked behind her back. She walked with her head low and her sleeves pulled long, not out of shame, but survival. Her master, Mr. Tanner, was a man of money and menace. Quick with his belt and quicker with a bottle. No one questioned what he did behind closed doors, but everyone heard the screams through the walls of the cookhouse. And then one day, she vanished. No warning, no goodbyes. Just a note on the saloon wall, posted by the blacksmith's boy. Sold to Elias Grady. Bill of sale witnessed by Sheriff Merton. Folks gathered round that paper like it was a ghost story pinned to the wood. Elias Grady. That name stirred something cold in the belly. Some said he was half mad, living up in Dead Horse Gulch with nothing but a mule and a broken rifle. Others swore he was a killer who'd buried his wife and child in the High Valley and never came down again. Once, long ago, he'd been a man of town, a builder, a father, a churchgoer. Then fire and fever took what he loved, and he walked into the woods and never looked back. So what was a man like that doing buying a slave? The theories came fast and mean. He needs a woman for company, spat old Varn at the general store. She'll be dead by winter. Miss Agnes at the post office crossed herself and said, "A soul that broken don't take in kindness. He'll make her a shadow like him." The preacher stayed quiet, but his wife wept that night after seeing the girl carried off, eyes blank as snowfall. The wagon that took Mei Lin into the pines was driven by Elias himself, though no one dared approach. He stepped out of the shadows like a bear, tall and stooped with sorrow, his beard like bramble and his coat stiff with years of cold. He said nothing. Not a word. He lifted the girl's bundle into the back, helped her climb without touching her skin, then turned the mule toward the mountains. "May God go with her," muttered the barkeep. "She ain't coming back," replied another. But as the wagon vanished into the trees, a silence fell over Bitter Creek. Not guilt, not sympathy, just the stillness that follows after a storm has passed, but before the next one begins. The townsfolk returned to their lives, but the story didn't die. It curled around their hearts like smoke. Why had Elias Grady taken her? What was he hiding in that lonely cabin? And would the girl return alive, or not at all? The first time Mei Lin refused him, it was with a whisper and lowered eyes. The second time, she said no with her whole body, stepping back, turning away, clutching her blouse at the collar with trembling fingers. Mr. Tanner, red-faced and reeking of whiskey, stared at her like she was a broken tool that had dared question the hand that used it. No one had ever told him no and walked free. And this little slip of a girl, no more than 19, had done it twice. The railroad camp outside Bitter Creek was no place for softness. Mei Lin had learned that quickly. Brought over under false promises of work and wages, she had become property before she ever touched American soil. Her days were filled with laundry, sweeping, cooking, and carrying heavy water buckets while men spat near her feet and muttered slurs in languages she didn't know. Her nights were worse, filled with the fear of footsteps, doors opening in the dark, and the sound of Tanner's boots pacing outside her quarters like a wolf circling a lamb. When he came to her that final night, she had expected the usual. Words she didn't understand, hands she feared, pain she couldn't voice. But something in her snapped. Maybe it was the way the stars looked that evening, clear and cold like her homeland's winter skies. Maybe it was the memory of her grandmother's voice telling stories of the fox spirit who refused to be caged. Or maybe it was just enough pain to make defiance feel like freedom. "No," she said, clear, sharp, in English. Tanner froze. Then, with the cruel smile of a man who owned everything he saw, he struck her across the mouth. Blood touched her lip. He backhanded her again, knocking her to the dirt floor. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. That made it worse for him. He wanted submission. He wanted tears. Instead, he got silence. The next morning, she was dragged out by the wrist and paraded before the men. "Too much fire in this one," Tanner sneered. "Don't need a woman who bites. I'm done with her." A piece of paper changed hands, signed with ink and bitterness. The sheriff watched from his post, doing nothing, his hat pulled low over eyes that wouldn't meet hers. One man approached Tanner quietly. Folks didn't hear what was said, but they saw the stranger, tall, hunched, wrapped in furs and silence, nod once. "Name's Elias Grady," whispered someone. "The mountain ghost? I thought he was dead." They watched as Mei Lin's wrists were bound with leather cord. Her arms were bruised. Her lip was split. Her eyes were dry and empty, like a well that had been emptied too many times. Tanner spat at her feet. "She's yours now. Do what you like." Grady didn't reply. He stepped forward, checked the cord at her wrist, then removed it gently, replacing it with a thick wool blanket. He lifted her bundle of clothes without comment and turned toward his mule wagon. Mei Lin hesitated. She looked back once, not at Tanner, but at the empty faces around her. Not one soul stepped forward. Not one voice said, "Stop." And so she walked into the forest with the ghost of a man, leaving the cruel world behind. Or so she hoped. The wind bit through every seam of Mei Lin's threadbare coat as the mule cart creaked over frozen earth. The wheels cracked over stones and snowdrifts, lurching forward with every step the mule took through the mountain pass. Trees loomed on both sides like silent sentries, their branches clawing at the gray sky. Mei Lin sat stiffly in the back, clutching her knees to her chest, her body rocking with the movement. Her breath fogged before her, but she made no sound. Elias Grady sat at the reins like a statue carved from winter itself. He hadn't spoken a word since they left Bitter Creek. His hat was pulled low, his coat dusted with frost, his gloved hands tight around the reins. Snowflakes clung to his beard. Every so often he would click his tongue and the mule would press forward. Beyond that, silence. Mei Lin didn't know how far they had traveled. An hour? 2? More? The camp, the jeers, the pain. Those things were already behind her, but their shadows stretched long. Every jolt of the cart sent pain through her ribs. Every gust of wind reminded her how little warmth she had. Her shoes were thin, soaked, and the soles split down the center. Cold bit into her toes until she could no longer feel them. Was this a new punishment? Tanner had spoken of Elias like a threat, a place to send someone when you didn't want them back. Was this man bringing her to a distant cliff to leave her for dead? Or would he wait until the trees thickened, until screams couldn't carry, and then... She shook the thought away, teeth chattering. At a narrow bend where the trees opened to a view of the valley, the wagon halted. Elias stepped down slowly. Mei Lin stiffened, bracing herself, hands clenched so tight her knuckles went pale. He walked around the side, boots crunching over snow, and reached up. She flinched, but he didn't grab her. He held up a hand, palm open, a silent offer. She looked at it like it might bite. Her legs ached as she stood, knees wobbling. She tried to climb down herself, slipping slightly. Before she could fall, his hand steadied her elbow, briefly, respectfully. Then he stepped back. They stood in silence under the iron-gray sky. Mei Lin's breath came fast. Her shoulders curled inward. He reached into his coat, pulled out a heavy wool blanket, coarse, dark, and worn, and held it out. She didn't move. He set it gently on the edge of the wagon, then returned to his place at the reins without a word. Mei Lin stared at the blanket for several moments before wrapping it around her shoulders. It smelled of pine and smoke. It was warm from his body. When they resumed the journey, she no longer trembled. Not because the cold had relented, but because something inside her had shifted. The silence wasn't as heavy now. The road was still unknown. The man beside her still unreadable, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid to breathe. As night fell over the mountains and stars blinked through the frost-bit sky, Mei Lin did not cry. She listened to the wind, the mule's hooves, the distant howl of a wolf, and held the blanket tighter. She had nothing but bruises and silence to her name, yet in that moment, wrapped in borrowed warmth, she began to believe that not all silence meant danger. Some silences, perhaps, meant peace. The cabin appeared like a memory out of the snow, half swallowed by pine and shadow. Its roof sagged slightly in the center, patched with bark and old tin. Smoke rose in a crooked line from the stone chimney, the only sign of life in a forest that seemed untouched for 100 years. The mule gave a weary grunt as Elias pulled the wagon into the clearing and halted beside a half-frozen woodpile. The trees pressed in all around, tall and watchful. Mei Lin sat motionless, the wool blanket still wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her legs had gone numb, her fingers stinging from the wind. Elias climbed down and walked to the cabin's front door. It creaked open on rusted hinges. He didn't look back, just pushed it wider, then turned to unbuckle the mule's harness. She waited. 10 seconds, 20, then climbed down without help. The snow came up to her shins. Her feet sank into the crusted surface with a soft crunch. the cold seeping in again where the warmth of the blanket couldn't reach. She looked around. No other homes, no fences, no paths, just forest and sky. She could run, but where? There were no stars to guide her tonight. Only trees, only darkness. Inside, the cabin was plain. The walls were logs, sealed with old mud. The floor was uneven, patched with mismatched boards, a table with one chair, a shelf with a dented kettle and 3 chipped bowls. A small cast-iron stove clicked as it radiated gentle heat. It smelled of smoke and pine resin and old tobacco. She hovered near the doorway, uncertain. Elias stepped past her, carrying in an armful of firewood. He placed it neatly beside the stove, then gestured vaguely toward the far corner. There, behind a thin curtain made of faded flower sackcloth, was a small room barely large enough for a cot. A patchwork quilt lay folded at the foot. A basin and pitcher stood in the corner. She stepped slowly inside, turning once to glance back at him. He wasn't watching her. He was crouched at the hearth, feeding dry pine into the fire. His face lit gold and flickering. No chains, no locks, no threats. He didn't follow her into the room. Instead, he stepped outside. Through the cracked window, she watched him settle onto a bench on the porch, wrapping himself in a second blanket. He leaned against the wall, silent, unmoving. The door creaked shut behind him, not slammed, not barred, just shut. Mei Lin sat on the edge of the cot, the old quilt pulled over her lap. Her hands trembled, not from cold now, but confusion. She had expected cruelty, commands, perhaps worse. What she found was a man who didn't touch, didn't speak, didn't demand. She didn't understand it. That night, she slept lightly, ears tuned to every sound. The crackle of the fire, the distant groan of trees in the wind, the occasional snort from the mule in its lean-to, but nothing else. No heavy boots, no rattling doorknob, no voices in the dark. When she woke to the pale light of dawn slipping through the window, the silence remained. Elias was still outside, seated in the same spot, a light dusting of snow over his coat and shoulders. He looked like part of the mountain, and though she didn't smile, didn't speak, didn't yet know what to think of this strange place, a small part of her, the part that had buried itself deep beneath bruises and fear, unfolded just slightly, like a frost-bitten flower daring to feel the sun, not safe, not yet, but no longer afraid. Snow fell without end, soft, relentless. It drifted down from a pale sky like the mountain was breathing out slowly, wrapping the world in silence. Days passed without a single voice spoken aloud, but not without motion. Elias rose early and left without a word, boots crunching through the drifts, rifle slung over his back. He would vanish into the trees with his mule and return at dusk, sometimes with a hare, sometimes a brace of grouse, once with a deer that fed them for a week. He never knocked, just set things by the door and left again. At first, Mei Lin remained within the tiny room, emerging only to eat or pour water into the basin to warm her numb fingers. But soon, the stillness began to stir something inside her, not fear, but instinct. She began to sweep the floor, clearing out the crust of dirt and leaves blown in by years of wind. She boiled water over the stove, scrubbing the grime from the bowls with torn cloth. She sewed the ripped curtain that hung between the rooms with thread pulled from her own clothes. She found small ways to make the cabin less forgotten. Elias never spoke of these changes, never praised, never questioned, but he did bring back a pot one day, new, or at least less rusted, and left it by the stove without comment. She understood. It was a kind of thank you. One afternoon, as snow lashed sideways across the tiny window, Mei Lin was tucking firewood into the corner of the stove when she noticed a small glint beneath the cot. She knelt and pulled out a wooden object, worn smooth by years and dust. It was a carved horse, tiny, no bigger than her palm. One leg was broken and glued back with pine resin. The mane was etched in swirling lines with a knife point, the detail careful. Tender. She turned it over in her hand, then cradled it to her chest for a moment, unsure why it made her throat ache. There were other things, too. Little signs of a life paused long ago. A woman's shawl folded inside a crate with sprigs of dried lavender still woven into the weave. A cracked teacup on a shelf that had not been used in years. In the eaves above the stove, a string of beads dangled from a nail, their colors faded but still catching the light when the sun dared shine through the frost-glazed window. None of it felt like a prison. It felt like a tomb. A place where something had once bloomed and then been left to wither under snow and sorrow. She didn't ask, couldn't. But as she swept the dust from the floorboards and boiled water for stew, she began to treat the cabin like a wounded creature. Gentle, slow, deliberate, as if kindness itself might coax it back to life. That night, Elias returned later than usual, boots heavy with ice, beard stiff with cold. He placed a tin of salt and a small bag of dried apples by the stove. Then, as always, he stepped outside without looking at her. But this time, before he shut the door, he paused. His eyes flicked once toward the wooden horse, now resting on the windowsill. He said nothing, but Mei Lin saw something in his eyes, just for a breath. Grief, maybe, or memory. And then the door closed again, leaving her in the warmth, alone, but no longer lonely. The morning had broken strange, too quiet, too still. The snow had stopped falling, but the clouds hung low and heavy, pressing against the tops of the pine trees like a weight waiting to drop. Mei Lin stood outside for the first time in days, the cold air biting at her cheeks as she rinsed a cooking pot in a basin of half-frozen water. Her breath plumed out in steady clouds. The sky smelled like ice and waiting. She had begun venturing outside more often, always when Elias was away. Never too far, just enough to feel the sun, if it ever showed, or to collect kindling from the edges of the tree line. The solitude was not as sharp as it once had been. It had dulled into something she could hold in her hands without bleeding. That morning, she hadn't heard the crunch of footsteps behind her, only the sudden crack of branches, the burst of snow falling from above, and the low, snarling grunt that vibrated through her chest like thunder in a box canyon. She turned and froze. It stood less than 20 paces away. A bear. Brown. Massive. Its fur matted and ribs showing through its winter-hungry frame. Its eyes were sunken and wild. It had caught her scent, maybe the faint trace of meat from last night's stew still clinging to her hands, and it had come down the slope, slow at first, then suddenly not slow at all. She backed toward the cabin door, heart pounding so loud it drowned the wind. Her fingers fumbled at the handle. It was latched from the inside. She had locked it earlier out of habit, unsure why she ever still feared an intruder. The bear lowered its head and pawed at the snow. It didn't charge yet, but it was close. Too close. She turned, darted to the porch, snatched the first thing she saw, a kitchen knife left near the chopping block. She held it tight, both hands, blade trembling. The bear took one step, then another, massive shoulders rolling like waves, breath steaming from its nostrils. A sound cracked through the trees, a sound she would never forget. One single gunshot. The bear jerked, staggered once, then collapsed into the snow with a groan so deep it shook the wind. Blood soaked into white, steam rising from the body. Mei Lin stood frozen, the knife still in her hands, breath ragged. Elias stepped into view from the edge of the woods, rifle lowered, eyes fixed on the beast. He didn't rush, just walked forward, calm as dawn, and checked that the creature was dead. Then he turned to her. She expected yelling, expected his anger for her being outside, for bringing danger to the cabin, for her foolishness. But instead, he looked at the knife in her hands. He nodded once. "You did good," he said. 3 words, not shouted, not mumbled, just spoken like fact. Mei Lin blinked. Her fingers loosened around the handle. No one had said she'd done well in a long time. Not in the camps. Not under Tanner's roof. Not in the town that looked through her like glass. And now, here, with a dead bear cooling in the snow. Those words struck deeper than fear. She looked at Elias, not as a ghost, not as a stranger, but as something else. A man carved hollow, yes, but not empty. Something in her chest that had been locked tight gave the faintest shift. When he turned to drag the carcass away for skinning, she followed without being asked, her feet crunching beside his in the snow. She carried the knife still, not as a weapon, but as proof. She had done good. Someone had seen it. The snow began to melt in thin, uneven patches, revealing the earth beneath in slow breaths. Where white had ruled for weeks, now came the mud and the brittle grass, the broken twigs, and the tracks of animals waking from their long winter sleep. The cabin remained still, smoke curling gently from its chimney, but the air felt different, less like weight, more like possibility. Mei Lin took to sitting outside in the mid-morning hours when the sun peeked through the clouds. She didn't wander far, just a few steps from the porch, down to a patch of exposed dirt near the woodpile. There, she would crouch with a pine twig in hand, dragging it lightly across the ground. At first, it was shapes, circles, flowers, the outline of a bird. Then symbols, characters only she could read. Each one pulled from her memory like drawing water from a deep, forgotten well. Elias saw her once, paused at the edge of the clearing as he returned from a hunt. He said nothing, just watched. She felt his eyes on her back, but not with suspicion. With quiet curiosity, the kind that doesn't ask for explanation, only observation. That evening after supper, Elias did something unexpected. He returned from the shed with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He set it beside the stove without a word and stepped outside to tend to the mule. Mei Lin waited until the door closed, then slowly untied the corners. Inside, a stub of charcoal, worn but usable, and a stack of old paper, yellowed at the edges, corners curled from age, some with ledger lines and others blank. Useless to most, precious to her. She stared at the bundle for a long moment. Then, with the care of someone handling memory itself, she took a sheet and the charcoal and began to write. The characters came slowly, deliberately. The strokes were clean, sure. One word first, then another. She filled the page with her language, not to communicate with him, but to return something to herself. Her name, her village. A line of poetry her grandmother had once sung while brushing her hair. And then, centered near the bottom, one word, Shiwang. The next morning, Elias found the page left by the table. He picked it up gently, fingers rough against the paper's soft crinkle. He looked at the characters, brows furrowed, and stepped outside where she was sweeping the porch. "What's this mean?" he asked, tapping the bottom line. Mei Lin looked at the page, then at him. The air was cool, sharp with pine, and full of space between them. She didn't smile, not exactly, but her lips softened. "Hope," she said. He looked at the page again. "Hope," He said it like he hadn't heard the word in years, like it was something he'd buried under snow long ago and had only now unearthed. He handed the paper back to her, then turned and walked down the path toward the woods, rifle over his shoulder. She stood still, the breeze tugging gently at her sleeves. Hope. A word neither of them had dared speak since their worlds had broken. And now it sat between them like a seed in thawed earth, waiting to grow. The storm had come sudden and mean, driving sleet against the cabin walls and rattling the shutters like fists demanding entry. Elias had gone out early, muttering about checking the trap line before the worst of it hit. Mei Lin remained behind, stoking the fire and boiling water for broth, watching the windows grow white with frost. She moved carefully through the small space, every motion part of a rhythm she had built in silence. Tend, repair, warm, clean. The floor creaked under her steps, same as always, but near the hearth, something sounded different. Hollow. Curious, she knelt, setting aside the broom, and pressed her palm against the warped wood. One of the boards shifted ever so slightly beneath her fingers. She wedged the edge of a spoon into the gap and lifted it free. Below, darkness. She reached in slowly, fingers brushing old fabric and metal latches. When she pulled the trunk free, it was small and battered, the corners dented, the hinges stained with rust. Her breath caught in her throat. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside, a baby's bonnet, hand-stitched and sun-bleached, tied with ribbon. A shawl, pale blue and worn soft from use, still faintly smelling of lavender. And beneath them, wrapped in oilskin, a photograph. Elias, younger, eyes not yet sunken, arm around a dark-haired woman with gentle eyes. Between them sat a toddler, laughing, tiny hands raised to the sky. Mei Lin stared. There were no names written, no dates. But she knew. The photo was stiff in her hands, a piece of another life preserved beneath her feet. Her throat ached with the weight of it. Carefully, she tucked everything back into the trunk, sealed it, and returned the board. She didn't notice Elias watching from the doorway. He said nothing, just stepped inside, shook off the cold, and went about his evening routine like nothing had changed. But she felt it, something brittle in the silence now, something that used to be buried and wasn't anymore. The days that followed were quiet, but not the same kind of quiet. He didn't avoid her. He still brought in firewood, still repaired the broken leg on the table, still handed her a sack of dried beans after returning from town. But his eyes lingered longer now, not suspicious, just distant, as if listening to something inside himself. Then, one night, as the fire cracked low and wind moaned against the shutters, he spoke. "She was named Clara," he said, voice rough like gravel in a dry creek bed. "My wife." Mei Lin looked up from her stitching, heart thudding. Little one was Rosie, just past 2 years when the fever came through. Town doctor didn't get here in time. By the time I found someone who could help, it was too late. He paused, staring into the flames like they held the memory still. After they passed, I stayed long enough to bury them. Then I came up here. Figured I'd die with the trees and be done with it. He leaned back, eyes distant. Never thought I'd speak those names again. Mei Lin didn't answer. She reached for the kettle, poured warm water into a tin cup, and held it out to him. He took it. Their fingers brushed. That night, the fire burned longer than usual. Neither of them spoke again, but something unspoken settled in the room like a promise, not of forgetting, but of remembering and still choosing to live. The wind howled through the trees that night, tugging at the cabin as if it were trying to tear it apart. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows against the walls, but the warmth inside felt small, fragile, like a candle fighting against the dark. Mei Lin sat by the hearth, her hands idle in her lap, the steady rhythm of her breathing the only sound beyond the storm. Elias didn't speak at first, sitting across from her, his face hardened by years of solitude and pain. He had returned late from the woods, his coat covered in snow, but now it was hung by the door, and he was seated before the fire, hands clasped around a mug of something warm. His eyes didn't meet hers, focused instead on the flames, distant. Mei Lin watched him quietly, a faint unease lingering in her chest. The silence between them had changed, sharper, heavier. It wasn't the same stillness as before. Something was breaking, something old and buried, ready to surface. Finally he spoke, his voice rough like he hadn't used it in years. The fever took her, Clara, my daughter. She stiffened, heart beating faster. He had never spoken of them, not like this. His words hung in the air like an unspoken confession. I thought she'd be fine. I thought it was just a cold, but she got worse. And then... He paused, eyes turning inward, the weight of the memory settling over him. We lived on the edge of town, far from the church, too far for the doctor to get to in time. By the time anyone came, she was already too far gone. Fever, delirium, the kind of thing you can't fight with whiskey or prayer. Mei Lin sat still, absorbing the pain in his voice, feeling the depth of the sorrow that bled through his every word. Clara couldn't handle it, he continued, his voice softer now, almost lost to the wind outside. She'd always been fragile, a quiet one. When she saw Rosie start to slip away, I couldn't stop her. She went after the town for help, but they were too busy with their own fears. They said they'd send a doctor, but they never did. Not until it was too late. He shook his head, his hands tightening around the mug in his hands. By the time anyone decided they were wrong, it was too late. My little girl died in her mother's arms, and there wasn't a soul in town who cared enough to stop it. They didn't care enough to save her. Elias fell silent, the words trailing off, fading like the embers in the fire. Mei Lin could feel his grief, the rawness of it, the way it had never healed. It was a wound that ran deep in him, one he had carried alone for too long. And then the anger came, the kind that had been buried beneath the years of silence, the weight of it pressing down on him. But that wasn't the worst of it, he murmured, voice breaking for the first time. The raiders came after. They killed Clara. They killed Rosie, too. And when they were done with them, they burned the house to the ground. Mei Lin's breath caught in her throat. She had heard stories, of course, whispers about raids and violence, but to hear it from him, to feel the rage and the devastation in his voice, made her blood run cold. His pain was no longer a story from the past. It was right here, in the room with them, thick and real. By the time I got to the cabin, there was nothing left, just smoke and ashes. He was quiet for a long time, his face turned down, a heavy sigh escaping his chest. And I couldn't face it. I couldn't stay there. So I came here, to the mountains, not to forget, but to suffer in silence, to be alone with the ghosts of what I couldn't save. Elias's words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Mei Lin sat still, feeling the weight of them like a physical presence pressing down on her. For a moment, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. Then, almost without thinking, Mei Lin reached out. Her hand, small and trembling, found his. At first, he didn't move, didn't react. But she held it, her fingers curling around his, offering warmth and the simplest form of comfort she had to give. His hand was rough, calloused from years of solitude. But it was warm, and for the first time, it wasn't just her pain that she carried. She could feel his too, fierce, unyielding, and unspoken. He didn't pull away. His grip tightened, just a little, and the world seemed to slow. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside, but for that moment, nothing else mattered. Mei Lin didn't have words for the grief that surrounded them both, but she didn't need them. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. Elias's broken past had become part of their shared story, and for the first time, Mei Lin knew without a doubt, that she wasn't alone in the mountains. She wasn't alone in the quiet, and neither was he. The snow had thinned to patches now, clinging in shaded corners and deep ravines, but around the cabin, earth was showing again, dark, rich, and waking. The air no longer bit as it once had. It touched gently now, as if winter itself was giving permission to breathe again. Ice still slicked the edges of the creek, and frost still clung to the porch railings at dawn, but the birds had begun to return. One morning, as Mei Lin swept the hearth, a chirping sound startled her. She turned toward the window. There, perched on the narrow sill, sat a small snowbird, its breast pale gray, its eyes sharp and curious. It hopped twice, fluffing its feathers, then let out another bright note, a song too sweet to belong in such a weather-worn place. Mei Lin stared for a long moment, then laughed, not a smile, not a polite breath through the nose. A laugh, pure, round, and sudden. It surprised even her. She pressed a hand to her mouth as the sound echoed softly against the log walls. The bird blinked, then fluttered off into the trees. Elias, sanding a piece of wood outside, heard the sound. He didn't come in right away, but he paused, eyes lifting toward the cabin, and for a moment, his hands went still. Later that day, Mei Lin gathered crushed berries and charcoal from the wood stove, mixing them with melted snow in an old tin plate. She found scraps of paper Elias had brought from town, some wrinkled, some torn at the edges, and began to paint. With her fingers first, then a slender stick she carved herself. She shaped the image of the snowbird, perched against a mountain sky, wings half lifted as if in prayer. She hadn't drawn since she was a child, not since her mother taught her how to use brushes made from twigs and hair, pigments from roots and soil. In the camp, there had been no room for such things. Under Tanner's rule, creativity was a danger, a waste. But here, in the cabin warmed by pine and quiet, it felt safe again. Not just safe, right. That evening, Elias entered carrying a bundle of cedar wood. He set it by the stove and noticed the scattered pages drying near the fire. Birds, branches, clouds, a figure that looked faintly like a girl wrapped in a heavy shawl. He said nothing, but the next morning, she found something by the windowsill where the snowbird had perched. A box, simple, square, finely made. The lid opened with a soft click, revealing slender compartments lined with scrap cloth. It wasn't fancy, but it was made with care, measured, smoothed, sealed. She ran her fingers over the grain of the wood, then looked up to find Elias by the door, wiping his hands on his coat. "For brushes," he said. Just that, then stepped outside again. She held the box for a long time. That night, she added a new painting to her small collection, 2 snowbirds flying in tandem, one trailing just behind the other, their wings open and even. And beneath them, a cabin, sturdy and small, with smoke rising into a sky that wasn't gray anymore, but brushed with soft blue. She placed it on the table beside the wooden horse and the folded shawl. The fire danced low in the stove, and the air inside no longer smelled only of ash, but of cedar and berries and something lighter than silence. The cabin was still rough, the floor still creaked, the wind still found its way in through the eaves, but it no longer felt like a place of hiding. It felt like home. The wind shifted in Bitter Creek the day trouble rode in. Folks didn't notice at first, not the way they notice a fire or a thunderstorm, but in small ways. The saloon doors stayed open longer than usual. The horses in the livery kicked their stalls, and the sun, though high, seemed to cast longer shadows than it had the day before. Mr. Tanner returned on horseback, flanked by two men in stiff railroad coats with pistols at their hips and eyes like steel traps. Their horses kicked up mud in the middle of Main Street, scattering chickens and drawing the attention of every pair of eyes behind every curtain. He rode straight to the sheriff's office, dismounted without tying his reins, and pushed open the door like he owned the whole town. Sheriff Merton sat behind his desk, whittling a piece of wood that no one could identify. He didn't look up. "Tanner," he said, "didn't figure to see you again so soon." Tanner tossed off his gloves, letting them fall to the floor. "I'm here for what's mine." The sheriff finally glanced up. "Didn't know you left anything." Tanner smiled the way a man does when he's already decided he's above the law. The girl, the China woman, the one that disappeared. She was sold, proper. "You signed the paper yourself." Tanner leaned forward, placing both hands on the desk. "I was drunk. That paper don't hold. And even if it does, she didn't go willing. That makes it theft." The sheriff shrugged, going back to his whittling. "Far as I see it, you handed her over. And the one who took her don't bother nobody. Doesn't make a sound. Stays to himself." "She's mine," Tanner snapped. "She ran. She was sold." "To a ghost," Tanner said with a sneer. "Elias Grady's not fit to raise a dog, let alone keep a woman." The sheriff didn't respond, just kept slicing curls from the wood, the pile at his feet growing slowly. Tanner stepped back, nostrils flaring, and turned toward the door. The railroad men followed without a word, but the threat was thick behind their silence. Outside, the saloon's porch creaked as a drunkard shifted in his chair. He'd been half dozing when Tanner passed, but the conversation had stirred him. He squinted through bloodshot eyes and called out, "Grady's up in Dead Horse Gulch. Got himself a shack above the old trail. Ain't but one path leads up." Tanner turned, eyes glinting. "Is that so?" The drunk nodded, scratching his beard. "She's been seen. Some say she's still alive. Some say he's got her tied up and trained to bark like a dog. Ain't no telling with a man like that." The townsfolk nearby didn't speak, but they listened. Whispers passed like wind through dry grass. Tanner mounted his horse, the sneer returning. "If the law won't fetch her, I will. And if Grady's got a problem with that, he can answer to me." Sheriff Merton watched from the doorway, one thumb hooked in his belt, his jaw clenched. "Ain't my business," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Not unless someone bleeds in the street." Tanner grinned, tipped his hat mockingly. "Then I'll make it your business soon enough." He turned his horse toward the edge of town, dust rising behind him, the railroad men close behind. Bitter Creek watched them go, watched the dust trail fade into the hills, and for a long while, no one said a word. But everyone knew. The peace up in those mountains was about to break. And Elias Grady, who had buried his past in snow and silence, was about to have it all dug up by the boots of a man who mistook cruelty for power, and this time there would be witnesses. By morning the story had taken root like wildfire in dry brush. At first, it was murmurs, whispers exchanged over fence posts and under breath at the general store. But by noon, the whole of Bitter Creek was humming with it. Mr. Tanner was riding toward Dead Horse Gulch, armed and righteous, And the China woman, the girl no one had spoken of since winter settled in, was the reason. "Fool thing to do," said Amos at the barber shop, shaking his head. "Grady's no man to be trifled with." "Maybe she bewitched him," muttered Mrs. Tully from behind her lace kerchief, eyes darting left and right. "Foreign girls know tricks. Maybe he's not himself." Others had their own theories, none kind, most cruel. That Elias was holding her against her will, that she was his slave now, that he'd snapped after all those years and built himself a kingdom of madness in the pines. But not everyone joined the chorus of fear. Cora, the midwife, heard it all while delivering soup to the widow Haskins. She set down the tray harder than she meant to and wiped her hands on her apron, jaw clenched. Her boots clicked against the wooden floor as she marched out, the wind catching her gray braid as she turned toward the church. Preacher Alden was in the chapel, polishing the pews for Sunday. He looked up when she entered, sensing the storm before she spoke. "You've heard?" she asked. He nodded. "Then you know what's about to happen if we let that man go up there alone." The preacher set the rag down and folded his hands. "I can't stop him, Cora. The sheriff's washed his hands. The town's frightened." Cora stepped closer, voice low but fierce. "This town let Elias Grady down once. When his wife came crying for help, we shut our doors. When his baby burned with fever, we waited too long. And when he buried them, we looked the other way and let him walk out of town like a stray dog." The preacher looked away. Guilt was a familiar weight in Bitter Creek, but rarely spoken aloud. "We won't let him fall again," she said, firm. "Not for doing what no one else had the courage to do. That girl, she was property to Tanner. Nothing more. Elias gave her warmth, silence, space to heal. That's more than most of us gave him." She didn't wait for agreement, just turned and walked out. Word spread differently after that. Not in loud declarations, but in quiet nods and lingering glances. Widow Haskins began knitting by her window again, this time a scarf in a small woman's size. The blacksmith repaired the broken hinge on the church gate and left a sack of nails by the chapel door. Even Sheriff Merton looked up from his desk a little more often, eyes tracing the horizon like he might see something coming that he couldn't stop, but might still be able to answer. By nightfall, a few good hearts began to gather, not in groups, not in loud protest, but one by one, in corners and back rooms, in pews and porches. They didn't speak of courage. They simply acted with it. Because deep down, they all knew. This time, silence would be a sin. The morning began like any other, quiet and silver with mist. Elias had left before first light, slipping into the trees with his rifle slung across his back, a coil of rope at his side, and a worn pouch of dried meat in his coat. The trap line stretched wide that time of year, and he had muttered something about needing to check near the ridgeline before the thaw made the creek swell. Mei Lin had nodded, wrapping herself in her shawl, watching him disappear into the forest without fear. She had come to trust those hours alone, those long silences filled only with the sound of wind and sparrows. She would sweep, warm water, paint, and feed the mule a bruised apple if one was left. She had made a place in this life, tentative, unspoken, but real. But just before midday, when the sun pushed through the fog and melted the frost from the eaves, the silence shifted. The birds fell quiet. The mule stamped and snorted uneasily. Then came the crunch of footsteps. Not heavy like Elias's, not cautious like a hunter, arrogant, loud, familiar. She was at the table when the door burst open. Tanner. He filled the frame like a storm. His coat still bore the dust of the town's road, his face slick with sweat, eyes wild and greedy. Behind him, two rough men stood silent, mouths set in grim lines. Mei Lin froze. The charcoal in her hand dropped to the floor. "There you are," Tanner sneered, stepping inside. "Thought you could run from me? Let some half-dead mountain rat keep you from what's owed?" She backed away, shaking her head. "No," she said, the word cracked but firm. "I'm free." He lunged. She grabbed the kettle, hurling it toward his face. He ducked, cursed, and she turned to run, toward the back room, toward the woods, toward anything but his hands. But the second man caught her by the arm. She twisted, kicked, bit. He cried out as her teeth sank into his wrist, and she tore away, racing toward the door. Tanner was already there. She clawed his face, fingernails drawing blood across his cheek. He hit her hard. She fell to the floor. The breath knocked from her lungs. "Bind her," Tanner barked, spitting blood to the side. They tied her wrists with rough cord, the same way they had months before. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders, her hair tangled across her face. She screamed with all the fury that had been buried since the day he sold her. Screamed so loud the crows took flight from the trees. But the trees didn't answer. They dragged her from the cabin, back through the snow-laced pines. One man threw her onto a waiting horse, holding her down while Tanner mounted. "You'll learn this time," he said, gripping the reins. "No more hiding." They rode off, vanishing between the trees. Her cries faded into the distance. Hours later, Elias returned. The sun had dropped low, and he came with a pheasant slung over his shoulder, humming low under his breath. The front door was ajar. Inside, the fire had gone out. Her cup lay shattered on the floor. The papers she had drawn on were scattered like fallen leaves. And on the windowsill, where once a snowbird had perched, sat a small wooden carving. It was the one she had made last week. He picked it up, slowly, carefully, like it might break beneath the weight of his hand. She hadn't left it there for decoration. She'd left it as a sign, a cry, a goodbye. Elias stood in the doorway, jaw clenched, the shadows of the trees growing long behind him. Then he turned, and without a word, vanished into the forest like a blade drawn from its sheath. The prints were fresh. 3 horses, moving fast. One wagon wheel, slightly warped, dragged a crooked line across the snow where it had frozen and thawed too many times. Elias crouched low, fingers grazing the trail. A tuft of dark hair, Mei Lin's, caught on a branch, fluttered in the wind like a signal flag. He didn't speak, didn't curse, didn't pause. His rifle lay across his back, his knife at his belt. But it was not the weapons that made him dangerous. It was the silence in him. A silence honed over years of grief and sharpened now by the theft of something he had not dared admit mattered. Not until it was taken. He moved like a wolf through the forest, eyes scanning the trees, ears tuned to the faintest shift in the wind. He passed the stream that still held ice at its edges, the same one she liked to paint when the light caught it just right. He passed broken branches, a scuffed boot print where she had fought. He could see it all, clear as words on a page. They had taken her toward the old logging road. That path led back toward the railroad camp, toward Tanner's domain, where men drank too much and laws bent like saplings under pressure. Mei Lin rode in the back of the wagon, wrists tied, mouth bruised where one of the men had struck her for biting him again. Her eyes were wide and dry, staring at the trees as they passed in a blur. Every jolt of the wheel sent pain through her spine. She could hear Tanner laughing up front, boasting about how the sheriff would look the other way, how no China woman would ever be missed. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out. And then, a sound, faint, distant, not a bird, not the wind, a whistle. Low, steady, rising like smoke through the pines. She opened her eyes, heart pounding. It was not a tune meant to charm or entertain. It was a call, an old sound Elias had used sometimes when he returned from the woods with firewood or meat. Just a single note, always the same. She had never asked its meaning. Now, it came again. Her breath caught. She twisted in the ropes, searching the trees. The wagon jerked, but she didn't stop. Her eyes scanned every shadow, every movement. Another whistle, closer now. The driver cursed, looked over his shoulder. "You hear that?" Tanner sat up straighter. Probably just wind. But the wind didn't sound like that. The horses grew restless. One reared slightly, eyes rolling. The other snorted, hooves slipping on the half-frozen mud. Tanner pulled his pistol from its holster. "Keep moving." Mei Lin pressed her face to the side of the wagon, her voice a hoarse whisper. "He's coming." And she believed it, not with hope born from desperation, but from the certainty that comes when winter begins to break and green starts pushing through the thaw. Elias Grady was out there, and he was hunting. The doors of Bitter Creek's church burst open with a crash like thunder, silencing every voice in the room. Sunlight spilled in behind the figure standing in the doorway, casting his silhouette long and dark across the pews. Dust danced in the beam, and for a breathless moment, no one moved. Elias Grady stood there, coat torn, boots caked in mud and blood, his face drawn with fury carved deep. The rifle slung over his shoulder was untouched, but his presence alone was weapon enough. The gathered crowd parted without a word as he stepped inside, slow and steady, each bootfall echoing like a drumbeat through the old wooden chapel. At the front of the church, Tanner turned, mid-sentence. He had been holding court like a self-appointed king, waving a folded paper in his hand and speaking of stolen property, of lawless men, of the girl he had retrieved. "She belongs to me," he declared moments before, with the arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him obedience. The mountain man took what he didn't have rights to. "She's mine by paper and payment." Now, as Elias approached, Tanner's words faltered. His jaw clenched. One hand drifted to the pistol at his hip, but something in the room told him not to draw. Elias stopped at the altar. Without a word, he reached into his coat and pulled out 2 papers. Weather-worn but clean, he laid them gently on the wood. The first, a deed of sale, signed by Tanner's own hand, witnessed by the sheriff and 2 townsfolk who now looked down at their boots in shame. The second, a written testimony from Cora, signed and sealed, detailing the bruises, the threats, the screams she had heard from the railroad camp. Her account, steady and clear, called it what it was: abuse, coercion, slavery. Gasps moved through the pews like wind through wheat. The preacher, pale, stepped forward and picked up the pages with trembling hands. He read the words aloud, voice cracking. Cora stood in the back, her arms crossed, chin lifted. "He beat that girl near to death and called it discipline," she said, loud enough for all to hear. "And now he comes boasting in God's house?" Tanner stepped forward, voice rising in panic. "She was mine. I paid for her passage. I fed her, clothed her." "She is no man's to own," Elias said. The words were quiet, steady, but they rang through the room like a bell. The sheriff, who had been leaning against the wall near the door, finally pushed himself upright. He walked slowly down the aisle, spurs clicking, his face unreadable. "You signed the paper, Tanner," he said. "Then you broke the law by taking her back." "She's nothing. She's not even—" "That's enough." The sheriff snapped cuffs on Tanner's wrists before the man could finish his sentence. The railroad men stepped back, eyes wide, unsure whether to run or fight. The townsfolk didn't lift a hand for them. The preacher folded the papers and handed them to the sheriff. "There will be justice," he said softly. As Tanner was led away, cursing and spitting, Elias stood still before the altar. Dust settled again. The church was quiet, but it was not the silence of fear. It was the stillness that follows a storm, broken but cleansing. Elias turned without ceremony and walked out the same way he had come, the doors swinging shut behind him. Behind him, Bitter Creek was changed, and for the first time, the people knew which side of the story they wanted to stand on. 2 days later, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through Bitter Creek once more, this time sharp, deliberate, the rhythm of law. The townsfolk gathered slowly as the rider dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. Dust rose beneath the black boots of a man wearing a long coat and a badge that glinted silver in the high sun. The federal marshal didn't say much when he arrived, but his eyes moved over the faces of the crowd like a man weighing truths left unsaid. Mei Lin stood on the porch of the church, wrapped in her shawl, her wrists still bearing the faint bruises of Tanner's ropes. Elias stood beside her, arms crossed, face unreadable. He hadn't left her side since the day he brought her back. He didn't speak unless she did, but his presence alone had become a shield no one dared challenge. Inside the town hall, a makeshift hearing was arranged. The preacher cleared the pews. The sheriff dragged in a table. The judge, a gray-bearded man from over in Sweetwater, had come in on the morning stagecoach. He sat stiffly, adjusting his spectacles, a man used to weighing men's deeds against the weight of the law. Tanner was brought in with chains around his wrists and a split lip from resisting arrest. He sneered when he saw Mei Lin. The sneer faded when he saw the federal marshal seated beside the judge, arms folded, hat resting on his knee like the weight of justice made real. Cora read her statement aloud again, clear, measured, full of quiet fury. She didn't cry. Neither did Mei Lin. Then came the papers. The sheriff held up the deed. The judge nodded. The marshal spoke for the first time. "This town let a sale happen under the pretense of legality, but there is no law in this land that grants ownership of a person. Chinese or not, woman or not, no human being is property." The room was silent. Even the old men who once muttered outside the saloon kept their heads low. Tanner tried to interrupt, sputtering about investments, contracts, the railroad needing order. The judge banged his gavel once, sharp. "You will answer for your actions," he said. "The charges are clear: human trafficking, unlawful imprisonment, and assault." Tanner's face twisted. She belonged to no one, not even herself. That was when Mei Lin stood. Her voice, soft but steady, cut through the air like snowfall in spring. "I belong to myself, and no one else." The marshal gave a single nod. The judge folded his hands. "Justice," he said, "is a river, slow but sure. It carves mountains in time, and today it flows through Bitter Creek." With that, Tanner was taken away. The wagon carrying him rolled out under heavy guard, heading for a prison east of the divide. The town watched in silence as the dust trailed behind him, and for the first time in memory, no one looked away. In that silence, something shifted, not just for Mei Lin, for all of them. The thaw came slow that year, as if the mountain was reluctant to let go of the cold, but it came all the same. Snow melted from the edges inward, revealing the dark, waiting earth beneath. Streams flowed again, trickling through stone and root. Buds pushed from branches like promises, and the smell of pine gave way to wild mint and damp soil. At the cabin in Dead Horse Gulch, the land came alive beneath Mei Lin's hands. She planted with care, fingers digging into the earth as though touching something sacred. She set rows of cabbage and carrots, herbs along the porch rail, and wildflowers near the windows where the sun reached longest in the morning. Each seed she pressed into the dirt was an act of quiet defiance against everything that had once been taken from her. Elias cleared the old garden fence, mended it without a word, and built a scarecrow with an old hat and a crooked grin. When she looked up and laughed at the sight of it, he only nodded and handed her a bundle of twine for the beans. She painted again too, this time with more than berries and ash. The townsfolk, having watched from a distance for so long, began to drift closer. First it was the children, curious and brave in the way only the young can be. They came up the trail in pairs and small groups, bringing baskets of eggs or asking about the lady who made birds from soot. Mei Lin welcomed them with a smile and set out old planks on crates for tables. She showed them how to hold a brush, how to press their hands into pigment and leave something behind that meant more than just mess. Letters followed, carefully drawn, traced in charcoal, repeated until they became names and stories. "She teaches with patience," Cora said one day, watching from the edge of the schoolyard where Elias now hammered together benches, his sleeves rolled, the sun warming the scars on his arms. "She sees what others don't," the preacher added softly. Word traveled. A girl who had once been cargo now taught their children to write their names. A man who had vanished into sorrow now carved seats so others could sit and learn. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the pines gold, a small crowd gathered near the porch, not for judgment, not for gossip, but for something simpler. "Tell us a story," a little boy asked, legs swinging from the bench Elias had made. "One with a bird, one that flies." Mei Lin looked out at the garden, at the rose beginning to green, at the flowers blooming from nothing but patience and time. She set aside her brush, folded her hands in her lap, and smiled. "Let me tell you one," she said. And so she did. Not of fire or fear, not of ropes or silence, but of a girl who planted hope in a place once forgotten, of a man who built with his hands what his heart had nearly lost, of a mountain that softened and a town that remembered how to change. She told them the story, their story. The sun hung low over the pines, spilling amber light across the clearing where the cabin stood, stronger now than it had ever been. New shingles patched the roof. The shutters, once crooked and sagging, now opened wide to let in the breeze. The path from the porch to the garden was lined with river stones, placed one by careful hands. Birds sang in the trees overhead, and in the distance the creek murmured like it had finally learned to speak kindly. On the porch, Elias sat in his old chair, the one with the worn arms and the smoothed seat carved by years of quiet. He leaned back, boots crossed, watching the wind tug gently at the tall sunflowers Mei Lin had planted by the fence. His beard had gone whiter over the past months, and his hands ached more than they used to, but his eyes, those were clearer than they had been in years. Beside him, Mei Lin sat cross-legged, a canvas balanced on her lap. She wasn't painting today, just sketching, charcoal in hand, letting lines find themselves slowly. The page was half filled with birds mid-flight and pine branches arching toward a sky only she could see. They didn't speak much anymore, not because they had nothing to say, but because most of what needed saying had already been understood. In the silences between them, there was warmth, not distance. Rest, not tension. The town still visited. Children still came to learn their letters, their colors, their stories. Sometimes Cora came to sit and sip tea in the shade. Sometimes the preacher brought wild honey and a book of parables, and always the town left something behind, a jar of preserves, a bundle of fresh cloth, a thank you note in a child's uneven hand. But this evening, It was just them. Elias shifted in his seat, rubbing one shoulder. "Back's getting stiff," he muttered. Mei Lin glanced up from her sketch. "You're old," she said plainly. He huffed. "Ain't news." She smiled, folding the page gently. "You know what the children call you behind your back?" He grunted. "What?" "Old Bear." Elias looked over, brow raised. "They say you growl and lumber and pretend not to care," she said. "But you always bring the extra wood for the stove and fix the broken stool when no one's looking." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Could be worse." She turned to him, eyes soft. "You mind if I call you that?" He looked at her, really looked at her. The girl who had once stood trembling on his porch, all bone and silence and bruised hope, now sat beside him, whole, steady, and radiant, in a way that had nothing to do with light. "No," he said, voice low. "You can call me that." She leaned her head against his shoulder. After a long pause, he added, "You know, I never had the right words before. Never thought I would. But if I had to say it now, I'd call you daughter." Mei Lin closed her eyes. "I'd like that," she whispered. The porch creaked beneath them as the wind moved through the trees like an old friend. The flowers swayed, the garden grew, the cabin stood, and for the first time in both their lives, peace wasn't something they chased or imagined. It was something they sat in, something they'd built, earned. No vengeance, no fire, just this, a new family, and the sound of birds returning home.